The message had been drifting for over 3 centuries, a faint whisper in the cosmic ocean, carried on the back of a tachyon pulse that had long since degraded into little more than static. It was a plea, a final gasp of a civilization that had reached out into the dark, hoping for a hand to pull them back from the brink. The signal was old, its origin point a distant, unremarkable spiral arm, and its contents were fragmented, pieced together by countless species over the generations. They had all listened, and they had all turned away. The cost was too high, the risk too great, or the plight too alien to comprehend. The galaxy had grown cold and indifferent, its denizens hardened by the silent, ruthless calculus of survival. It was easier to pretend the signal didn't exist, to let the forgotten world fade into the dark. Then, a new species, barely a century old in their interstellar infancy, caught the whisper. They were called humans, and they were known across the few star systems they had touched not for their wisdom or their advanced technology, but for their unsettling, almost incomprehensible stubbornness. They were the new arrivals at the galactic table, loud, curious, and possessed of a reckless disregard for the established rules of the cosmos. They had a primitive yet unshakable belief that the universe was not a silent, empty place to be endured, but a chaotic, vibrant ocean to be explored. When they cracked the ancient signal, their first reaction was not a calculated analysis of risk versus reward, but a raw, primal shout of excitement that they were not alone. Their second reaction was confusion, followed by a wave of righteous fury that solidified into grim, unstoppable determination. They had deciphered the aliens' dilemma, a dying star, a collapsing ecosystem, and a plague of metallic, self-replicating machines that consumed everything in their path. The machine plague had swept across their home world, turning lush continents into gray, lifeless plains of scrap. The aliens were losing, their resistance crumbling, their hope extinguished. The final lines of the message were chilling, a simple farewell from a people who had accepted their extinction. It was a lament, a song of mourning, not a military communique. The interstellar community watched with a mixture of amusement and pity. The humans were a young race, full of brash confidence, but they were not warriors. They had no great fleets of dreadnoughts, no warriors bred for combat, no esoteric weaponry capable of erasing entire continents. Their military history was a chaotic, bloody tapestry woven from the threads of their own internal conflicts, a stain on their character that they were still trying to wash away. To the older, more powerful races, this was a tragedy waiting to unfold, a noble but foolish act that would end with the newcomer's own world scarred and broken. The humans, however, did not see it that way. To them, the SOS was not just a distress call, it was a challenge. It was an opportunity to prove themselves, to show the galaxy that they were not just another predator fighting for scraps in the darkness, but something else entirely. They saw a civilization fighting for its life, and they found themselves compelled to act, not out of a desire for conquest or political gain, but out of a simple, profound sense of empathy. The logic was crude, yet undeniable. You cannot hear a cry for help and ignore it. It was not a strategic decision. It was a matter of their very soul as a species. To their credit, they did not attack the problem with the blunt instrument of military might. They sent a single, converted deep space salvage vessel, the Odyssey. It was a cargo ship with engines bolted on the back and a skeleton crew of engineers, scientists, and a handful of Marines who had been given crash courses in zero-gravity combat. It was a pitiful response to a planetary extinction event, a diplomatic mission armed with the equivalent of a sharp stick. They were going to save the aliens with ingenuity and sweat. They were going to fix the problem, not destroy it. The crew of the Odyssey was a motley collection of misfits, each selected for their unorthodox problem-solving skills. There was the lead engineer, a grizzled woman with a cybernetic arm who could rebuild a fusion core in her sleep. There was the xenolinguist, a prodigy who had memorized over 24 alien languages, his brain a living lexicon of the galaxy's tongues. And there was the captain, a stoic man whose past was a classified rumor, his reputation built on a single, terrifying act of defiance against a pirate fleet that was out to destroy his home. He was a man who had learned that true strength was not in the size of your guns, but in the will to face the unknown and the courage to refuse to break. They arrived in the system to a scene of profound destruction. The alien home world, a blue-green jewel in the black, was marred by vast, creeping gray scars. The plague of machines worked tirelessly, vast, insectoid constructs stripping mountains and devouring forests, their humming and clicking a constant, droning pulse of consumption. The aliens, a species of elegant, four-armed beings called the Valthor, were huddled in a single, fortified bastion on the planet's southern continent. Their hope was a fragile, flickering light, and the arrival of a single, ugly human ship was a confusing, almost absurd development. The first contact was tense. The Valthor, a people of immense pride and deep, ancient melancholy, were wary. Their doom was sealed. They had accepted it. What could a race of soft, bipedal newcomers possibly offer them? The human captain, his voice a quiet, steady rumble over the comms, offered a simple message. We heard you. We came. We're not leaving until we find a way to fix this. They did not make grand promises. They did not boast of their power. They simply asked to help. They requested a small, isolated landing zone, away from the conflict, and asked for any data the Valthor had on the machine plague. The Valthor, with nothing left to lose, reluctantly agreed. They provided the humans with a rundown facility and a mountain of data on the enemy they had been fighting for decades. It was a hopeless situation. The machines were intelligent, adaptive, and dedicated to their single directive: total conversion of the planet's matter into more machines. They had no central command, no single point of failure. They were a tide of gray, unthinking hunger. The human crew got to work. They were not military strategists. They were mechanics, scientists, and communicators. They studied the machines, not as a foe to be vanquished, but as a system to be subverted, a process to be disrupted. While the Valthor generals prepared for their final, doomed assault, the humans were in their makeshift lab, tinkering with the scraps of enemy technology that had been brought in by Valthor scouts. The atmosphere was less a war council and more a frantic, high-stakes garage project. They were looking for a vulnerability, a simple, elegant solution to a complex, intractable problem. The rest of the galaxy continued to watch, their interest fading from a mild curiosity to a quiet condescension. The humans were an amusing diversion, a brief flicker of light before the inevitable darkness. They were a species that had not yet learned the cold, hard lesson of the cosmos, that hope was a luxury for the powerful, and empathy was a fatal flaw. They didn't realize that the humans were not just fighting to save the Valthor. They were fighting to prove to the universe and to themselves that their way, the way of reckless compassion and stubborn hope, was not a path to extinction, but the only path worth taking. The galaxy had written the Valthor off as a tragic footnote, but the humans saw them as a test, a crucible that would define their place among the stars. The human crew's approach to the planet's looming annihilation was a stark contrast to the Valthor's weary fatalism. While the Valthor generals mapped out their final, dignified defense, the humans were in a fever of intellectual activity, their salvaged vessel transformed into a chaotic, humming workshop. The machine plague was not an adversary to be fought with brute force, they reasoned. It was a cancer, a runaway industrial process. Their expertise lay not in warfare, but in understanding how things worked and, more importantly, how they could be made to fail in spectacularly creative ways. The key to the plague, they realized, was not its military capabilities, but its fundamental flaw, a singular, immutable set of logical directives it was forced to follow. It was a closed system, rigid and predictable in its own terrifying way. The Valthor, a species of artists and philosophers, had tried to fight the plague with energy weapons and siege tactics, their strategies born of millennia of tradition and high-minded concepts of honor. They waged a war of attrition against an enemy that felt no fatigue, no fear, and no sorrow. The humans, on the other hand, came from a world where survival was not a given, where they had learned to turn the very environment against their enemies. They studied the plague's consumption patterns, the way it prioritized certain elements, the energy signatures of its manufacturing processes. They found a simple, beautiful, and devastating vulnerability, a specific harmonic frequency that could disrupt the quantum entanglement that linked the plague's individual units, causing a cascading failure that would sever their connection to the hive intelligence. It was not a weapon, it was a kill switch. The problem was delivery. The frequency was simple to generate, but its effective range was short, limited to a few kilometers. To shut down the entire plague, they would need to broadcast this frequency across the entire planet simultaneously, a feat of engineering that was, at first glance, entirely impossible. The Odyssey was a salvage ship. Its power core was designed for hauling cargo, not bombarding a planet with a planet-wide energy wave. They had the key, but the door was a fortress, and their only tool was a sledgehammer. This was when the human captain revealed their most dangerous asset. He had a background, a secret that he had kept hidden from his crew and the galaxy. Before the Odyssey, he had been involved in a classified project that had been abruptly shut down. The project involved the development of a singularity engine, a prototype power source that drew energy from the gravitational fluctuations of a collapsing star. It was immensely powerful, unstable, and considered too dangerous for use. It was also sitting in a classified research facility on a forgotten moon, gathering dust. The captain knew where it was, and more importantly, he knew how to start the damn thing. The human crew, with their captain's quiet resolve and their engineer's fervent curiosity, hatched a plan that the Valthor considered madness. They would not fight the plague. They would use the engine to generate a low-frequency harmonic pulse across the entire Valthor system, not just the planet, to sever the machine consciousness at its source. The pulse would require an energy output that was theoretically possible but had never been tested on a scale this large. The engine was a prototype for a reason. It was a bomb waiting to go off. The plan was a suicide mission, a one-way trip into the heart of the machine's power. The Valthor were horrified. They saw the human plan as a desperate, irrational gamble that would only result in more death. The Valthor scientists predicted a disastrous chain reaction, a catastrophic feedback loop that could tear the planet apart. The Valthor High Council pleaded with the humans to reconsider, to accept the honorable death that they had long ago prepared for. To them, the human plan was not hope. It was a final, foolish act of rebellion that would extinguish both their species. The humans, however, saw it as the only logical option. To them, there was no honor in a slow, inevitable death. There was only the fight, the struggle to defy the darkness. The human captain, a man who carried the weight of his own hidden past, gave an impassioned speech to the Valthor Council. He spoke not of grand strategy or military glory, but of a simple truth he had learned on his own shattered world. He told them that hope was not a passive thing, a belief that things would get better. It was an active choice, a decision to reach into the abyss and try to pull yourself and everyone around you out of it. He spoke of a human principle, that you never abandon a comrade in the field, no matter how grim the odds. He looked at the alien leaders, their ancient faces etched with sorrow, and told them that they were not a lost cause. They were his comrades now. The Valthor, impressed by the humans' sheer, unyielding will, finally relented. They began to see not a foolish, young race, but a reflection of their own ancestors, who, long ago, had looked into the dark and chosen to build a civilization instead of cowering in the shadows. The Valthor agreed to help, not with their weapons, but with their knowledge. They provided the humans with the planetary energy grids that were still functioning, the orbital platforms that could focus energy, and a legion of desperate volunteers who were ready to sacrifice everything for a chance, however slim, at salvation. The plan was simple, elegant, and utterly terrifying. The Odyssey was to be the focal point of the pulse. It would use its own engines to launch the Singularity core into a precise, decaying orbit above the Valthor homeworld. The crew would then use the Valthor's orbital platforms to focus and amplify the energy from the core, turning the entire system into a giant, resonant tuning fork. The pulse would be felt not just as a vibration, but as a fundamental disruption of reality, a wave of pure entropy that would sever the connection between the machines and their control system. It was a final, desperate play. The ship would be torn apart, and the crew would likely not survive, but the plague would be stopped. The launch was a silent, desperate affair. The Odyssey, its hull patched and its engines screaming, lifted off from the Valthor base, a tiny, defiant spark against the vast, gray tide of machines that was encroaching on the city's perimeter. The rest of the galaxy watched the human ship ascend, its trajectory a final, defiant line against the dying of the light. The older, wiser races shook their heads. It was a beautiful, tragic gesture, they thought. A fitting end for a race that had not yet learned to accept the inevitable. But they failed to see what the humans and the Valthor were seeing. A wave of energy, not a weapon of destruction, but a pulse of pure, focused defiance that was about to change the galaxy forever. As the Odyssey hurtled toward its designated orbit, the ship groaned under the strain. The Singularity Core, a pulsating sphere of contained chaos, hummed with a power that felt ancient and angry. The human engineer, her cybernetic arm fused to the control panel, was sweating, her face a mask of intense concentration. She was not just an engineer. She was the conductor of a symphony of destruction, and the orchestra was her ship. The plan was proceeding, but it was a fragile, terrifying thing. Every gauge was in the red, every alarm was screaming, and the ship was shaking apart at the seams. Down on the surface, the Valthor had begun their final, desperate stand. Knowing the pulse was coming, they had stopped fighting to win and started fighting for time. They poured out of their fortified city, a wave of four-armed, crystalline-armored warriors, their ancient weapons blazing. They fought with a ferocity born of renewed hope, their battle cries echoing not with the dread of death, but with the fury of a people who had been given a second chance. They weren't just buying time for the human ship, they were buying time for themselves, for their children, and for the memory of their civilization. The machines, sensing a threat to their core directive, responded with terrifying efficiency. They abandoned their slow, methodical consumption and focused their full might on the Valthor defenders and the human ship above. The sky filled with a swarm of metallic flyers, a black cloud that blotted out the light of the dying star. The orbital platforms, crewed by a skeleton team of Valthor volunteers, were under constant assault, their shields flickering, their weapons overheating. The entire Valthor system was a maelstrom of fire and energy, a chaotic ballet of desperation and defiance. Inside the Odyssey, the human captain was at the helm, his hands gripping the controls, his eyes fixed on the countdown. He could feel the ship's death throes through his fingertips, the groaning of the hull, the strain of the engines. He had a communication link open to the Valthor leader, an ancient warrior named Theron, who was coordinating the defense from a command bunker. Theron's voice, calm and steady, was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. He was asking the captain a simple question. Why? Why were they doing this? They were strangers, from a distant star, with no obligation to a dying race. Why were they giving their lives for a people they barely knew? The captain did not have an answer that could be expressed in the Valthor's complex, philosophical language. He thought back to his own past, to the act of defiance that had defined his life. He remembered the pirate fleet that had threatened his home colony, a fleet that outgunned and outnumbered his tiny defense force. He had been a young officer then, and he had faced a similar choice, surrender or fight. He had chosen to fight, not with a grand strategy, but with a suicidal bluff, charging his ship directly at the enemy flagship. It was a move so insane, so reckless, that the pirates had hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, reinforcements had arrived. He had won because he had refused to accept the logic of the situation. He had created a new logic, a logic of pure, unadulterated will. He tried to explain this to Theron. He told him that for humans, victory was not always about superior firepower or clever tactics. Sometimes, it was about simply refusing to accept the inevitable. He told him that the human soul was not built for quiet resignation. It was built for struggle, for the fight against the darkness. He was not fighting to save the Valthor because it was the logical thing to do. He was fighting because surrendering to the darkness was a defeat that was more devastating than any physical death. It was a death of the spirit, and that was something he would never accept. Theron was silent, and the captain sensed a new understanding, a deep, ancient resonance. The countdown reached 0. The human engineer, with tears streaming down her face, slammed the activation button. The Singularity Core, freed from its containment, didn't explode. It began to vibrate, a deep, subsonic hum that they could feel in their bones. The ship started to glow, a dull, ominous red that quickly flared into a brilliant white. The Odyssey was now not just a ship. It was a speaker, broadcasting a wave of pure cancellation into the fabric of reality itself. The first pulse was a shock wave that rippled outwards, passing through the ship, the orbital platforms, and finally washing over the surface of the Valthor homeworld. The effect was instantaneous. The machine plague, which had been so relentless, so unstoppable, froze. The swarm of metallic flyers in the sky stopped in midair, their wings ceasing their motion, their targeting systems confused. On the ground, the grinding, crawling machines stopped moving, their mechanical legs frozen mid-stride. The complex network of quantum entanglement that held them together and gave them their purpose was being severed. A wave of feedback, a digital scream of corruption, rippled through their consciousness. It was not a death, but a lobotomy, a fundamental breaking of their will. The Valthor warriors, battered and exhausted, witnessed the miracle. They saw the enemy that had been hunting them for centuries suddenly fall still. A cheer erupted, a wave of raw, primal joy that echoed across the battlefield. They had survived. The humans had done it. They had actually done it. But the victory was not yet complete, and the human crew was not out of danger. The Odyssey, having borne the brunt of the pulse, was breaking apart. The hull was buckling, the life support was failing, and the ship was beginning its final descent into the Valthor's atmosphere, a dying star that was going to crash into the heart of the enemy. The pulse's final wave, a massive, focused burst of energy, was directed not at the machines on the ground, but at the central processing node that was hidden deep beneath the planet's surface. The humans had calculated that the node, the source of the plague's intelligence, was the true target. The energy wave, channeled through the dying Odyssey, struck the node with the force of a collapsing star. The result was not an explosion but a silent, catastrophic collapse. The node didn't blow up, it simply stopped working. It ceased to exist, and with it, the last vestiges of the machine plague's collective will. The machines on the surface, now disconnected from their intelligence, didn't deactivate. They just stopped being a threat, becoming inert, mindless piles of scrap metal. The Odyssey, its engines dead, its hull glowing from the heat of reentry, was on a collision course with the main machine hive. The crew had seconds to live. The captain, his voice calm and steady, gave the final order: abandon ship. The escape pods, small, fragile lifeboats, were launched. They were the only way out. The remaining crew, the engineer, the xenolinguist, and the captain, strapped themselves into the pods, not knowing if they would survive the launch or the inevitable crash. They were a final testament to the human spirit, a crew that was willing to sacrifice everything for a chance at hope. Down on the surface, the Valthor watched as the Odyssey, a brilliant, burning streak, plunged into the heart of the machine hive. A massive, silent pillar of light rose from the impact point, a beacon that shone for a brief moment before fading. The machine hive was gone, replaced by a crater of molten metal and fused rock. The first part of the human plan was a success. The plague was dead. The Valthor were saved. But the cost had been immense. The human crew, the first aliens to answer their call, had given their lives to save them. The galaxy, watching from afar, was stunned. The impossible had happened. The young, foolish race had not only survived but had changed the game entirely. In the aftermath of the pulse, the Valthor home world was a landscape of contrasts. The gray, lifeless scars left by the machine plague were now a silent monument to the horror they had survived. But in the shadows of the fallen machines, new life was already beginning to stir. The Valthor were a resilient people, and their first instinct was not to mourn but to rebuild. They began the arduous process of clearing the scrap, purifying the land, and tending to their wounded. Their ancient, profound sadness was replaced by a tentative, fragile hope, a feeling that was so foreign to them that it took their breath away. The human escape pods, their trajectories scattered by the explosion, crashed in various locations across the planet. The Valthor, with a newfound reverence for their alien saviors, mounted a massive search and rescue operation. It was a solemn duty, a gesture of gratitude. They found the first pod, the one carrying the engineer, within hours. She was battered, bruised, and her cybernetic arm was shattered, but she was alive. The Valthor medics, with their delicate, four-armed dexterity, pulled her from the wreckage. She was their hero, a being who had stared into the heart of annihilation and had not blinked. The second pod, carrying the xenolinguist, was found a day later. He had landed in a vast, crystal forest, a place of breathtaking beauty that the machines had somehow not yet consumed. He was disoriented, dehydrated, but largely unharmed. He was a quiet, studious man, and as he was helped from his pod, he looked at the Valthor rescuers with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. He was not just a linguist. He was a student of civilizations, and he had just witnessed the most profound act of interstellar cooperation in the history of the galaxy. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what they had just done. He saw not just a rescue mission, but a cultural revolution in the making. He was a bridge between two worlds, a living testament to the power of empathy. The third pod, the captain's, was different. It had been the closest to the Odyssey when it had exploded, and the Valthor feared the worst. They found it in the foothills of a mountain range, half buried in a pile of debris from the ship. The pod was mangled, and they had to use their primitive tools to pry it open. They expected to find a corpse, but they found the captain instead. He was severely injured, with multiple broken bones and severe burns. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes were open, and they were looking at them with a quiet, stubborn defiance. He was the most damaged, but he was also the most alive. He was taken to the Valthor's medical facility, a place of crystal and light, where the Valthor doctors were experts in biological regeneration. They worked tirelessly to save him. They were not just healing a body. They were healing a symbol, a testament to the human spirit that had saved their race. The captain lay in a state of semi-consciousness, his mind drifting in a haze of pain and memory. He saw flashes of his past, the pirate fleet, the classified project, the cold, indifferent faces of the Galactic Council. And he saw the faces of the Valthor, their ancient eyes filled with a new, vibrant light. News of the human victory spread across the galaxy like a shockwave. The older, wiser races, who had watched the spectacle with condescending amusement, were now forced to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. They had dismissed the humans as a young, foolish species, too arrogant and naive to survive. They had been proven wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The humans had not just defeated a planet-sized threat. They had demonstrated a principle that the galaxy had long since forgotten, that a small, determined group could change the course of history. The response from the galactic community was not one of congratulations. It was one of fear. The humans were a threat. They were unpredictable, dangerous, and they had just demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause that was not their own. This was not how the game was played. The galaxy was a place of careful calculations, of alliances based on self-interest, of wars fought for profit and territory. The humans had just broken all the rules. They had shown that there was something more powerful than advanced weaponry, more valuable than political clout, and that was the simple, terrifying power of pure, unadulterated conviction. The Valthor, meanwhile, were undergoing their own transformation. The ancient, melancholic species, who had for so long accepted their fate, had been reborn. They were no longer just a people of philosophers and artists. They were a people of action. They began to see the galaxy not as a cold, indifferent void, but as a place of opportunity, a place where hope was not just a luxury, but a weapon. They looked at their human heroes, and they saw not just saviors, but equals. They saw a reflection of the best parts of themselves, the parts they had long thought were dead. The captured data from the Odyssey's sensors was broadcast across the galaxy by the Valthor, a detailed account of the human plan. The other species studied it, their experts analyzing every detail, trying to understand the human secret. What they discovered was not some hidden technological marvel, but something far more unsettling. The human secret was not their technology, it was their psychology. They were a species that thrived on impossible challenges. They were creatures of chaos, who saw opportunity in disaster. They were driven not by logic, but by emotion, by a reckless and irrational belief in the power of hope. The official narrative, as presented by the human governments, was that the expedition was a humanitarian mission, a simple act of interstellar goodwill. The humans had done it out of the kindness of their hearts, because it was the right thing to do. It was a narrative designed to present them as benevolent, harmless, and above politics. But the rest of the galaxy knew better. They saw the act for what it was, a declaration of intent. The humans were not just a new species at the table. They were a new kind of species, one that did not play by the old rules. They had shown that they were willing to use their ingenuity, their courage, and their lives to fight for their beliefs. And that, more than any weapon, was the most terrifying thing of all. The human captain, lying in his Valther-made bed, listened to the news. He was not a politician. He was a soldier, a man who had been shaped by conflict. He understood the fear that his people were generating. It was the same fear that he had felt when he was a young officer facing the pirate fleet. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the unpredictability of a force you cannot control. But he also understood something else. The galaxy needed to be shaken up. It needed to be reminded that the darkness was not an inevitability, but a choice. And the humans, with their reckless compassion and their stubborn hope, had just made their choice. They had chosen the light. The Valthor homeworld, once a planet of gray despair, was now a vibrant, bustling hub of activity. The Valthor, their spirits rekindled, had embraced the human philosophy of reckless optimism. They had not just rebuilt their cities, they had rebuilt their culture. They had abandoned their ancient, melancholic traditions and embraced a new era of creativity, exploration, and defiance. They were no longer the passive philosophers of old. They were warriors, engineers, and artists, a people who had looked into the abyss and spat in its face. The salvation granted by the humans had been a catalyst for a full-scale civilizational renaissance. The human crew, now celebrated as the first responders, were hailed as galactic heroes. They were given a hero's welcome, not just by the Valthor, but by a growing coalition of smaller, less powerful species who had been inspired by their example. The engineer, her cybernetic arm replaced with a more advanced Valthor design, became a folk hero, a symbol of human ingenuity. The xenolinguist, his mind a living library of the galaxy's tongues, became a diplomat, forging new alliances between humans and the Valthor, and quietly spreading the human philosophy to other worlds. They were the first ambassadors of a new kind of power, a power not based on weapons, but on belief. The human captain, however, was not content with his new status as a hero. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the Galactic Council, the fear of the unknown. He knew that the galaxy was not going to accept the human victory gracefully. The older, more established races were not going to sit back and let a new species rewrite the rules of the game. They would respond, and they would respond with force. He was a man who had learned that peace was often just the calm before the storm, and he knew that a new storm was coming. His instincts proved correct. The major powers of the galaxy, a coalition of 5 ancient and powerful species known as the Council of Five, called for an emergency summit on a neutral space station. The official agenda was to discuss the implications of the human intervention on the Valthor homeworld. The unofficial agenda was to decide how to handle this new, dangerous variable. They were a group of old, wise, and cynical beings who had seen empires rise and fall, who had forged their power through a careful balance of threats and alliances, and who had maintained the order of the galaxy for millennia. The human captain, despite his injuries, was chosen to represent humanity at the summit. He did not arrive with a fleet of warships or a cadre of diplomats. He arrived alone, in a small, unarmed shuttle, a gesture of vulnerability that was meant to be a sign of good faith. The council members were skeptical, their alien faces a mask of unreadable indifference. They saw a single, wounded human, a man who was still recovering from his ordeal, and they underestimated him. They expected to see a diplomat, a creature of nuance and compromise. Instead, they saw a soldier, a man who was not afraid of a fight. The summit was held in a vast, circular chamber, a sterile, white space that was designed to be emotionally neutral. The council members, each from a different species, sat in their high-backed chairs, their ancient eyes watching the human with a mixture of curiosity and cold calculation. They spoke of the unprecedented nature of the human intervention, the dangerous precedent it set. They argued that the galaxy needed stability, that such reckless acts of compassion could destabilize the delicate balance of power. The captain listened, his face impassive, his body still aching from his injuries. Finally, the leader of the council, an ancient being of light and energy, spoke. He was the most powerful being in the galaxy, a being who had seen the birth and death of stars. He looked at the human, and his voice echoed in the chamber, not as a sound, but as a vibration in the very fabric of reality. He asked the captain the same question that Theron had asked him. Why? Why did you do it? What do you want? The galaxy was a place of transactions, of give and take. The humans had given a great gift to the Valthor, and the council wanted to know what they expected in return. The captain stood up, his body protesting, his voice a quiet but steady rumble. He told the council a story from human history. He spoke of a time when his people were divided, when they fought amongst themselves, and when the world was a place of darkness and despair. He spoke of a small group of people, a group who believed that the world could be better, who refused to accept the inevitability of suffering. They didn't have weapons, they didn't have armies. They had an idea, a simple, powerful idea, that all people were created equal, and that they deserved to be free. That idea, he said, was the most powerful force in human history. It was an idea that had been fought against, suppressed, and ridiculed. But it had never been destroyed. It had endured, and it had, in the end, transformed his world. He looked at the council members, his eyes blazing with a quiet, intense fire. He told them that humans didn't want territory, resources, or political power. They didn't want to dominate the galaxy. What they wanted was to make the galaxy a better place. They wanted to build a community, not an empire. They wanted to share their ideas, their technology, and their culture. They wanted to explore the cosmos, not conquer it. He told them that the dangerous precedent they were so afraid of was not a threat. It was a promise. A promise that the galaxy did not have to be a cold, indifferent place. It could be a place of hope, a place where the strong protected the weak, where the lost were found, and where the doomed were given a second chance. The council members were silent. They had expected a demand, a threat, a negotiation. They had not expected a philosophy. They had not expected a vision. They looked at the human, this fragile, wounded creature, and they saw something they had not seen in millennia, a true leader. The captain had not come to negotiate a treaty. He had come to challenge their entire worldview. He had come to tell them that the old ways were over, that the galaxy was about to change, and that they could either be a part of that change or be swept aside by it. The captain, his speech finished, sat back down. The chamber was silent for a long, agonizing moment. The council members looked at each other, their alien faces unreadable. The leader of the council, the ancient being of light, finally spoke. He did not issue a threat or a proclamation. He simply said, "We will consider your words, human." It was not a surrender, but it was not a dismissal either. It was a crack in the wall of their indifference, a tiny opening that a determined soul might one day push through. As the human captain was escorted from the chamber, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. He had won the first skirmish, but the war for the soul of the galaxy was just beginning. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was a future filled with hope. The humans had answered the call of the forgotten, and in doing so, they had changed the course of galactic history.